morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Jessica DeGanzik, the Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and welcome to episode 48 of Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. An important part of our events, and Dan's favorite part of his webinars, is hearing from you. So we'll be taking your questions in about 30 minutes. You can click on the questions section on your control panel on the right-hand side and send in your questions there, and I will get to as many of those questions as possible when we get to the questions section. Dan will be focusing on 3 topics this week. First, crisis at the border, finding answers on immigration. Second, can Congress act on gun violence? And third, Israel's elections. Now comes the hard part. Dan, thank you so much. I'll turn this conversation over to you and join you in about 30 minutes with some questions from our audience. Thank you so much.
Jessica, thanks so much for the nice introduction. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in a little while, so when we broaden the conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us. As Jessica mentioned, and I hadn't really thought of it, episode 48 of this series, and if you remember that we took a couple weeks off over the holidays, that means we've been doing this for almost a full year. And here we are at the end of March. We've made it through a year of shutdown. And although things have improved to some degree, this is still certainly the time of coronavirus. And so our title for the webinar is going to continue, at least for the foreseeable future. So Jessica mentioned 3 topics that we're going to be covering today: gun violence, the border crisis, and the Israeli elections. I think the first thing to acknowledge before we dig in a little bit deeper is that none of these issues is going to be resolved anytime soon. Last Thursday, in President Biden's first full news conference since taking office, he made it very clear that his main focus would continue to be on Covet and on the economy, and that issues like immigration and guns were long-term problems that would require long-term efforts before real progress could be made. And most Washington observers interpreted that as saying that these issues, as important as they were, issues like the border, issues like gun violence, were not going to cause the president to veer off of the priorities that he'd set for the country, handling the coronavirus and the plague of gun violence that we continue to experience here in the US. So those 2 topics, it looks like, go on the back burner. And for those of you who follow Israeli politics, you know that elections in that country are really just the beginning, and that negotiations over who will be Israel's next prime minister and which multi-party coalition will control the Knesset will go on for weeks and could very likely result in yet another, a 5th election there. But anyway, even though none of these topics is going to be scheduled between now and episode 49 next Tuesday, hopefully this week we can provide you with some useful guidance on how these 3 debates and how these 3 discussions might proceed. So let's start with immigration. And before I get into that topic at all, let's start out with the question of the president's priorities that I was just mentioning. And so Claire, if you can put up our first question for our group: is Biden right to prioritize COVID and the economy first? Or should he make immigration reform and the border crisis more urgent goals? Pretty straightforward binary choice here. I know we usually give you many different options here, but this one's pretty clear cut. Should Biden stay the course? COVID and the economy are the country's 2 biggest challenges. Everything else is going to have to wait. Or 2, immigration reform. Alternatively, immigration reform is too important to wait, so he has to address it now. And let's see if our group agrees with the president. And it appears that they do by an overwhelming margin. Look at that. 84% agree with Biden, which is that the coronavirus challenge and economic regrowth have to come first. And although it can't be easy given the severity of these crises, looks like immigration reform is going to have to wait. So much more decided outcome in our first polling question than we normally see from you people. So very interesting, very interesting. But let's dig in a little bit more on the immigration issue, even though it's not something that's going to rise to that level of priority. For those of you who are with us regularly, you may remember that we talked about this issue. We talked about the border on March 2nd, 4 weeks ago today. And at that time, at the beginning of this month, I shared a few statistics with you about the border. And I told you that in January, the Border Patrol was referring 47 children a day to the Health and Human Services Agency. In early February, that number had almost quadrupled to more than 200 a day. By the end of February, it had risen to well over 300 young people a day. And these are just minors, not migrants altogether, but unaccompanied minors coming to this country. And when we talked about this 4 weeks ago, I then projected those numbers forward. Said if you assume about 320 arrivals a day of unaccompanied minors, over the course of the year, that would mean 117,000 children would arrive in this country. Now, I'll admit to you, and I hope it came across at the time, I meant that figure as an exaggeration. It didn't occur to me or to most observers that that level of influx was going to continue. And the figure 117,000 was meant more to make a point about the increase than to make an actual prediction. But since then, the challenge has deepened dramatically. That 117,000 figure that I referred to a few weeks ago, that works out to about 10,000 unaccompanied minors per month. So let me give you an update. Over the weekend, just a few days ago, an internal Biden administration memo was leaked. And that memo projected that the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border could move up to as much as 16,000 this month, as opposed to 10,000 like we thought only a few weeks ago. That number could rise to as much as 22,000 unaccompanied minors in May, and as many as 26,000 unaccompanied minors coming in September. So let's put that in a little bit of perspective. Until this month, the all-time record for children and teens coming to this country without parents, without their families, was 11,475. And that was 2 years ago, in May of 2019. The minimum projections for summer and early fall this year are more than twice that. So the record set 2 years ago will almost certainly be more than doubled in the scope of this current situation. Now, Biden has announced what I think are some very smart long-term measures. He's announced that additional financial resources should go to the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Central America, to Guatemala, to Honduras, and to El Salvador, for economic aid and to help with law enforcement and corruption and gang violence. He's asked Mexico for additional assistance at the border, which Mexico agreed to do on the same day that Biden agreed to send them large quantities of doses of COVID vaccine. Well, the Biden administration says the two were not related. And Biden has asked his vice president, Kamala Harris, to spearhead ongoing efforts in those countries, in Central America and with Mexico. In the short term, the administration has secured sports arenas and convention centers in San Antonio and San Diego and elsewhere. And they're actually flying some of the arrivals because there's been such an influx at the southern border. The administration is actually flying some of the migrants up to the U.S.-Canada border for them to be processed there, because the crowds are so large at the U.S.-Mexico border. They're also talking about speeding the release of these children to guardians in this country, although that would mean shortening the background checks that make sure these children are released into situations that are safe. So to sum up, it's a mess. And the debate going on in Washington is less about the solution, because frankly, no one has any good short-term answers, and more about whose fault this is. Biden and his supporters say that Trump left him with a mess. Trump and his supporters say that Biden's being too lenient, which is encouraging people to make the trip. So I guess what I'd like to ask you, which of those two options do you think is closer to the truth? Is Biden right that Trump is responsible for dismantling the system? Is Trump right that Biden is being too welcoming and encouraging large numbers to come? Or both? are both somewhat responsible, and in fact, this is a bigger crisis than either one of them individually. Let's see what we get from you guys. Wow, look at that, 65%, almost 2/3 of our group, to your credit, goes beyond partisan politics. It says this isn't a partisan issue. It's not just Trump's fault. It's not just Biden's fault, but rather it's something that's much bigger than even a president of either party can take on. A slightly larger number say that Trump bears primary responsibility. 14% say Biden do. But the real takeaway here is how many of you say that it is really bigger than one president or one party. So now, while all this is going on, the crisis at the border is causing public support for immigration reform to drop. Remember that right after taking office, Biden called for comprehensive immigration reform that included a pathway to citizenship for all of the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. Now, in January, 57% of the American people thought that Biden's proposal was a good idea. Last week, new polling came out showing that support for that plan was down to 43%. So in just 2 months, 14% of Americans had changed their mind about comprehensive immigration reform. And we believe that's largely because of the situation at the border. And it is worth noting that among Biden's own Democratic Party, there's been a 15% drop in support for his proposal over that time period. So Biden's challenge at the border is difficult enough, but now it looks like it may impact his long-term policy goals too. Because the centrist Democrats whose support he needs for comprehensive reform are becoming very, very nervous about what they're seeing on the news every night from the border. And the real irony, the cruel irony, is that the more welcoming that Biden is to newly arrived immigrants, the more difficult it's going to be for him to pass a broader reform package. This crisis is not going anywhere anytime soon. And while there might be support to pass legalization measures for the dreamers, the young people who came here without documentation with their parents when they were young, possibly for farm workers, realists in both parties are now talking about the more comprehensive reform is becoming more and more difficult because of the situation we're seeing at the border, at least to a large degree. Now, I'm going to add one other wrinkle to this before we go on to the next subject. We've talked before on this program about the root causes of immigration, and this is one of the reasons that Biden's decision to provide financial assistance to Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador is so important. You know, people leave their homes for a lot of reasons, because of crime, because of political persecution, and for the prospect of jobs and better economic opportunity. But now we're seeing a new factor driving this migration northward, not just from Latin America to the United States, but from Africa and the Middle East into Europe. And that new factor is climate change. Because climate change, while it will by definition affect the entire world, logically it's going to disproportionately affect the people living in the poorer, hotter countries that are already a major source of migrants to the United States and Europe. And that means that the United States and Europe, and even countries like India, are very likely to face a permanent and likely growing flow of climate migrants that most of these countries, including ours, are just not equipped to deal with. A couple of quick statistics. The World Bank did a study on this recently, and they estimate that 3 regions, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, will generate 143 million climate migrants in the next 30 years by the year 2050. 143 million more migrants than what we're already expecting. And those models project that migration from Central America to the US will rise every year. And they believe that more than 30 million migrants would head to the US border over that time period. Now, at the same time, the Gallup Public Opinion Research Company did a poll of Latin America and the Caribbean. And in that poll, they found that 120 million residents of that region want to move permanently to another country. More than 40 million of them want to move to the United States. And so while we're dealing with a temporary problem now as it relates to these young people coming across the border, what's waiting around the corner for us is a much, much bigger challenge. And you can call it a crisis, you can call it a challenge, you can call it a good thing or a bad thing. But the debate we're seeing now is not going away under this president, and probably not under his successor either, which I think underscores the point that so many of you made, that this is bigger than one president and one party, and a challenge our country will be dealing with for many, many years to come. All right, let's move on. Our second topic is gun violence. And last week, we talked about the shootings in Atlanta and whether those shootings were considered hate crimes or not. And that led us into a broader discussion about discrimination against ethnic minorities of the type that Asian Americans have faced in increasing numbers over the last year or so since the coronavirus pandemic's reached the United States. Now, in his news conference, Biden did indicate that he was considering some executive orders to confront gun violence. But like on immigration, he suggested that broader legislation would have to wait, given his priorities of COVID and the economy. And some of the more impassioned supporters of gun control, people who worked very hard for Biden's election, were furious. They basically said, Mr. President, how dare you say that the lives of innocent people, of innocent children as a result of gun violence isn't as much of a priority as these other things. But Biden is focused. And if there is going to be broader gun control legislation, we're probably not going to see it in the immediate future, given the import of COVID and the economy on the Biden agenda. So once again, before we go further into this topic, I'm going to ask you the same question about guns that we did earlier about immigration and the border. Is Biden right? Is Biden right to prioritize COVID and the economy first? Or should he make the threat of gun violence a more urgent goal? And once again, we're giving you just two choices here. Stay the course. The COVID and the economy just have to come first, as difficult as that might be. Or second, gun violence, even more than immigration, is too important to wait, and we really have to address it now. So let's see what we got. Well, the numbers are a little bit lower, but still overwhelmingly in favor of staying the course and supporting Biden's agenda to stick with his focus on COVID and the economy going forward, even given the import of these other issues. So a little bit lower than on immigration, but not much at all. Now, as all of you know, and we have talked about this before too, gun control, the issue of gun violence is an issue that's almost always led to congressional gridlock in the past. It's now been more than 20 years since significant gun control legislation has passed Congress. But Senators Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, and Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania, who are working together on some legislation, Murphy and Toomey do believe there's a possibility for some progress, most notably, in their opinion, on the topic of expanded background checks. Now, Murphy acknowledged that the gun bills that passed the House earlier this month would not get through the Senate. Not only would Republicans not support it, but most centrist Democrats would not either. The House bills would have expanded background checks to include private transactions between unlicensed individuals and would have closed a loophole that allows gun sales to go through after 3 business days, even if the background check is incomplete. Like I said, it's not just Republicans, it's moderate Democrats who have some concerns about expanding background checks to include private transactions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Because Murphy believes that if you relax the House-approved limitations on gun sales between family members, in other words, if you didn't require a background check, one member of an extended family sold a gun to another member of his or her family, Murphy thinks that by getting rid of that provision, the Democrats would, the supporters of the legislation would be able to get the centrist Democrats to sign on, and some Republicans as well. And I think some of the other things that would survive the elimination of that question about selling guns to family members, they believe they could win Republican support for other expansions of background checks, like private sales at gun shows and internet sales, if they're willing to horse trade a little bit on the question of sales between family members. The other possibility they've pointed to for progress is with what's called the red flag measures. And these are provisions which would keep guns from those with mental illness. And these red flag laws, which exist in about 17 or 18 states around the country already, these red flag laws are intended to restrict potentially dangerous people rather than focusing on the weapons. And that approach is seen as much more likely to attract bipartisan support. And Senator Mitch McConnell talked favorably about red flag laws today in his press comments. So these are state laws that there are state laws that authorize courts to issue a special type of protection order. And it allows the police to temporarily confiscate firearms from people who are deemed by a judge to be a danger to themselves or to others. So once again, it's not focusing on the gun, it's focusing on the individual. And so what happens in California and the other states where these red flag laws are in place, the request for the order will come from relatives or friends who are concerned about someone they care about, who owns guns and has expressed suicidal thoughts or discussed shooting people or some other type of broader violence. The authorities can also request an order, but usually this comes from a family, a friend, a coworker saying, I'm worried about so-and-so, and then the court looks into it. But there's another shift that's happening here too, and this is a broader one. Before the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, Democrats rarely made guns a major focus in campaigns because they were concerned that that's an issue that would cost their party in swing states, not only with Republican voters, but with moderate Democrats in exurban and rural areas as well. But in the last few election cycles, after Newtown, after Parkland, after so many others, we're starting to see a lot more proactive gun control advocacy. We've seen the emergence of very well-organized, well-funded gun control movement that's still outspent by gun right groups. But if you look at an organization like Michael Bloomberg's Anytown organization, and at the legal difficulties and financial difficulties that the National Rifle Association have been experiencing, Murphy and Toomey and others believe that that change in the overall landscape has laid the groundwork for at least some progress on this issue. But it's not going to be easy. The opponents of gun control legislation already argue, and in fairness, they argue correctly, that the shooter in Colorado, in Boulder, passed a background check to buy his weapon just a few days before the shooting, and that he used a pistol, not a semi-automatic rifle. So it's not going to be an easy fight. But like I said, the strongest proponents for gun control do believe that on the topics of background checks and on red flag laws, there is the opportunity for some progress. Well, that's what they think. Better question is, what do you think? Do you think Congress is going to strengthen gun laws this year? Yes or no? No middle ground. If you think that that's possible, even given the priorities that Biden set out, then obviously that's a yes vote. And if you think for all the reasons we alluded to, that we're going to see gridlock yet again, then obviously that's a no vote. So what do we have? Well, maybe not quite as optimistic a crowd on this issue as on the others. 69%, more than 2/3 of you, don't think, even given the optimism that Murphy and Toomey and others have expressed, more than 2/3 of you think the gridlock's going to continue. Just under 1/3 think that there is the opportunity for progress. I'd be interested, had we been doing this program, Claire, for longer, whether these numbers are different now than they would have been a year or two ago. But at least right now, our group does still sound somewhat skeptical. So finally, let's move on and talk briefly about the Israeli elections, and we'll come back and talk about this issue in more detail as negotiations progress, because like I said earlier, we really are just getting started here. Last week, Israel held yet another round of elections. This is its fourth round of elections in the last 2 years, and once again, Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party finished first, but once again, without the necessary support to achieve a majority and form a new government. So right now, they're at a stalemate. No party has the ability to form a majority coalition yet, and the Israeli president, Reuven Rivlin, is preparing to ask one of the parties, either Likud or one of their competitors, to begin that process in the next couple of weeks. But regardless of who becomes prime minister, whether Netanyahu keeps the job, whether Yair Lapid, his closest competitor from the Yesh Atid party, whether it's any of the other party leaders, regardless of who wins the prime minister office, I would submit to you, we might not know the identity of the individual, but the outcome in one important way is entirely predictable. Because I'd argue to you that whether Netanyahu survives or not, the agenda that he shaped for Israel's place in the region and the world on international and security issues is going to continue for the foreseeable future, with or without Netanyahu himself. And I'll explain that in a little more depth in just a minute, but before I do, I'd like to ask you guys one more question, and this one we're going to ask you to predict again. How do you think this is going to turn out? Who do you think is going to be Israel's prime minister 1 year from now, either as a result of this election, or if they do end up having a fifth election season? Who's going to win? And we thought about listing all the candidates, but we thought we'd make it more simple yet again. So it's once again, we're pretty binary. Do you think Bibi's going to be prime minister once the dust settles? Or do you think that his record-setting term as Israel's leader is done, and we'll see another prime minister in the months ahead? And what's our answer? Oh, this is a close one. 54%. 54% of you think that someone else will become prime minister, either as a result of these negotiations or a fifth round of elections. A little bit less than half, 46% think Bibi is going to survive. And so we'll certainly talk about this in the weeks ahead and revisit the question again to see if your opinions hold or if they change. So I want to go back to the point I was making earlier. Regardless of which of the candidates becomes prime minister when these negotiations are over, no matter who wins, Israel is going to be led by a government that's increasingly committed to strengthening ties with the Arab Gulf countries. And either way, Israel is going to be led by a leader with diminishing interest in achieving peace with the Palestinians. Regardless of whether Netanyahu keeps his job or is replaced, either way, Israel is going to continue to warn the US and other Western democracies of the dangers of negotiating with Iran on a nuclear agreement. And either way, whether Netanyahu keeps his job or one of the other major candidates replaces him, they're going to try to push negotiations over Iran's nuclear capacity to include agreements on ballistic missiles and terrorist-sponsored activities. And regardless of how this all comes out, more broadly, the right-leaning orthodoxy that Netanyahu has established on international relations and foreign policy and security matters over the last several years is going to continue to shape Israel's strategy, because every single one of his top competitors is either a former member of Netanyahu's cabinet or his personal staff, who split with him either as a matter of domestic policy or because of Netanyahu's own legal troubles. But none of them offer a significantly different direction for the country on international relations, on foreign policy, and on security issues. And as this process moves forward, we can talk about the other candidates in greater detail. Like I said, Yair Lapid finished second in the voting, or his party, the Yesh Atid party, finished second in the voting. He looks like he would be the most plausible successor to Netanyahu, at least in the short run. But Naftali Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, Benny Gantz, there's no shortage of other contenders for that job. either now or in the months ahead. And even though they come at Israeli domestic policy in very different ways, when it comes to questions of security and geopolitics, the only question for Israel to determine is, do they want Bibiism with Bibi or Bibiism without him? So we've reached the bottom of the hour, and as Jessica mentioned earlier, now we get to my favorite part of the program, where she rejoins me, and I get to hear your questions and your thoughts, either on the topics that we discussed or on other issues in the news that are important to you. So Jessica, let's get started. Let's see if we can get through as many of these as possible today.
Great, thank you so much. First question, when something is leaked to the press, such as the figures on children crossing the border that you mentioned, who is it who leaks that info? I wouldn't expect leaks in the Biden administration.
Well, it's a smart question. And there's no question that there are a lot fewer leaks in the Biden administration than we saw in the Trump administration. Just like we didn't see much leaking or backbiting during Biden's campaign, he's put together, not completely, but a fairly loyal and fairly unified team underneath him. Now, they're not immune from leaks. Ron Klain, as chief of staff, has taken some anonymous shots in the press from White House staff who disagree with decisions that he's made. But to the question that arises, who would leak? I think whenever you read in the newspaper, whenever you see online, whenever you hear on TV or the radio, whenever you hear information leaked, here's the question to ask yourself. The question to ask yourself is, who benefits from having this information in public? So if there's a leak about whether Ron Klain is spending too much time with progressives and not enough time with moderates, well, that leak probably came from the moderates who are upset that he's not spending enough time with them. My guess, and of course it's just a guess, is the source of the leak on the border numbers was not by someone unhappy with Biden, but rather something that if Biden didn't authorize, it's something that he probably didn't argue against, because the goal of having this information in public is to prepare the American people for a very trying set of challenges going forward. If Biden stands up, or if Kamala Harris stands up and announces these statistics, they sound defeatist. They sound a little bit beleaguered. But if the information is leaked out without fingerprints, then the idea is to prepare us as the electorate so that when the administration announces more measures in terms of border control, or if something they do doesn't work as quickly or as well as they would have hoped, they won't be judged as harshly, because this information has preconditioned us to expect something much more challenging than we might have thought previously.
We see a lot of support for migrant groups into Greece and other parts of Europe from war-torn areas in the Middle East and Africa. Besides the US, what is the international community doing to address the Central American migrant crisis?
Well, the rest of the world is dealing with migrant crises of their own. In other words, there's not a lot that Europe is doing to address the Central American crisis, because, as the questioner correctly noted, they're dealing with a challenge of their own in terms of refugees and other migrants coming from the Middle East and from Africa. Similarly, for those coming from South Asia, they're generally not transversing continents, but looking for destinations closer to home. So almost every wealthy democracy in the world, Europe, North America, Asia, or elsewhere, are dealing with an unanticipated influx of migrants. And the point that I was making is that climate change is going to make those numbers rise not just precipitously, but for many, many years. And I don't know that any country is particularly well prepared to deal with this crisis. And I can say with confidence that there is no international consensus, not between Europe and the US, not between the US and its Asian allies. There is no international consensus on how to deal with this challenge, except there seems to be populist sentiment in most of these wealthier countries, which is, we support immigrants and we empathize with them, but we don't want too many of them in our country, so maybe they can go somewhere else. I should emphasize that that's not my sentiment, but rather me paraphrasing what public opinion polling shows in most wealthier countries. There's a great deal of sympathy, a great deal of empathy for those who are suffering and want to seek a better life elsewhere. But in most of the nation's wealthier countries, they would prefer that those immigrants found somewhere else to settle.
Are most of the accompanied minors requesting asylum or asking for family reunion?
Most of the minors at this point are asking for asylum. There is a percentage of them who do have parents in this country, in which case the unification provisions would kick in. But for many more of them, they would be connected to another relative, to a family friend, to an individual in the community who's willing to help these children through difficult times. And that's why the screening process is so important. When we hear about these young children who are spending days and days and days in these centers, the logical question to ask is, well, why is it taking so long? Why can't we move them somewhere else more quickly? And the answer is because the faster you run the background check on the potential guardian, the less certain you can be that that potential guardian is someone who can be safely entrusted with this young person. So that's why we're seeing the Biden administration putting up young people in hotels and convention centers and sports arenas and that sort of thing to buy some time and create some space so that the background checks can be done appropriately without the border facilities themselves being as overwhelmed as has been the case in recent weeks.
Will or should Biden separate out the dreamers to get that passed? And I think that was in reference to a bill that you were discussing earlier in the conversation.
Right. As comprehensive reform and a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants becomes less and less likely, at least in the short to medium term, there are a few groups, the Democrats in Congress and that the Biden administration has been prioritizing. One are the dreamers, again, those young people who came here as children with their parents without documentation. There's a considered push to create a legalization path for farm workers, and another for those seeking temporary refugee status, who are coming to this country not just for economic opportunities, but fleeing violence in their home countries. And my guess would be, of those three, the most likely to achieve some bipartisan support would be legislation that would allow these young people, these dreamers, to at least become legalized residents and hopefully to work toward citizenship. It's the one of the three on which some Republicans, have voiced the most support. So it probably is the smarter path for Biden to take going forward. The criticism he gets is for those who are advocating for broader reform efforts, for all those in the country without documentation. They worry if only the most politically popular group is allowed to become legal, that makes the chances even worse for the rest of the undocumented population. And I certainly sympathize with that argument. But I do think that the challenges that these young people are facing is such a unique one that if that opportunity can be realized, it's something they ought to pursue.
Are there any talks going on with President Lopez Obrador of Mexico and the leaders of other Central American countries to help address this crisis?
There are conversations going on, and I mentioned briefly in my opening that the Biden administration had agreed to provide large quantities of COVID vaccines to Mexico after previously having rejected Mexico's request. When Obrador and Biden talked for the first time, Obrador did ask for millions of doses, and Biden told him very politely, he said, I need to take care of our own country first before we can help you. A matter of days later, it became clear that the Biden administration needed Mexico to become more cooperative in overseeing the borders, both the US-Mexico border and Mexico's southern border. And while their spokespersons went to great lengths to say that the two were not related at all, it is notable that in such close proximity, Biden did decide to provide the vaccine doses to Mexico at roughly the same time that Mexico agreed to create better cooperation. As I said earlier, Biden has appointed Vice President Harris to work closely with the leaders of the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, of Honduras, and El Salvador on this. So it looks like the coordination efforts are underway, but no matter how effectively these conversations proceed, this is a long-term solution. And while it's an important long-term solution, there's a short-term crisis as well that's much harder for this type of cooperative effort to address.
This questioner says, 40 years ago, the 807 initiative created a lot of garment sewing jobs in Northern Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, at the expense of Asia. Could this be replicated today at China's expense to create jobs there again?
It could be. And the question is a smart one, and it raises two important points as it relates to this issue. One is the importance of providing not just economic relief to these countries of origin, but providing some basis for economic development to create an even greater disincentive for an individual or a family to leave, to come northward. And then second, the reference to Asia is a really, really smart one also, because while the pathway from Mexico is obviously a much more convenient one, we've reached a point where in this country, we now see more Asian American immigration every year than immigration from Latin America. Now that's a combination of legal and illegal, so I don't want to conflate the discussions altogether. But that kind of economic aid and economic support is precisely what China is providing to less developed countries in Asia and in Latin America and Africa as well. And the geopolitics, the geopolitical advantage that China realizes from providing that kind of support in economic aid is considerable. And as we've talked about in this webinar in the past, one of the US's greatest challenges under a Biden presidency is reestablishing its presence on the world stage and reassuring these less developed countries that we do want to be there for them. But that's not a message that these nations or their people have heard for the past 4 years. So there's a lot of scrambling, a lot of making up ground to do.
Thank you. Most wealthy countries are getting many migrants. We never hear of any going to China. Why?
Well, there are two primary factors that draw transnational migration. One is economic opportunity. The other is freedom. And number one, traveling into China without documentation is more difficult than into this country or in European countries. But second, a migrant who wants to relocate to start a better life for themselves and their families generally prefers to do that in an area, in a country in which there is not an authoritarian government, because in addition to their economic opportunity, they do want the freedom and liberties. And even in other parts of Asia, where the geographic distance isn't as much, there's not a great deal of incentive to immigrate into China because of concerns on the nature of their government, on questions of human rights, and on the treatment of ethnic minorities. So I think we talk a lot about economic growth. The personal freedom and liberty question is a considerable one also. And I suspect that that's the greatest reason that China does not see more immigration inflow.
Gun violence or immigration will not be actionable until Democrats have filibuster-proof majorities in Congress, as well as control over a majority of state legislatures. Shouldn't a priority for Democrats, therefore, be the 2022 and 2024 elections?
Well, I think that the 22 and 24 elections are priorities for the Democrats, and they are for the Republicans as well. But I think the questioner makes a really, really important point. There's a lot of talk about getting rid of the filibuster, whether it's to pass the Voting Rights Act, whether it's to accomplish more stringent gun control measures, to take on immigration, to pass the president's infrastructure package. But the thing to remember is that in a Senate and a House that are so closely divided, not only do the Democrats not have the votes to eliminate the filibuster itself, Senators Manchin and Sinema and a few others are still hesitant on that front. But on every issue we mentioned, on guns, on immigration, on the Voting Rights Act, on infrastructure, there are Democrats who are more centrist Democrats who are reluctant to support a more aggressive agenda from the left. And so the questioner is exactly right. If the Democratic majority in the Senate was not 51 votes, but 61, well, then it becomes much easier to pass legislation. And in fact, there's an argument to be made, as the questioner implies, that that's a better way of doing it than trying to change the rules of the filibuster. Because the argument against changing the filibuster, as we've discussed before, is while the Democrats might be able to pass some of their policy priorities by absolute majority now, the next time Republicans hold Congress, they'd be able to. And this is the threat that the reminder that Senator McConnell issued a few weeks ago. He essentially said, you think that climate change and immigration isn't important enough to pass by majority vote? He said, well, my members think that abortion rights is just as important. And so the debate over whether to eliminate the filibuster or not does play in both directions. And the questioner's suggestion that the most effective answer is not changing the rules, but creating a sufficient sized majority on one side or the other is a lot more likely to be productive and a lot more likely to be lasting.
Thank you. What about requiring gun safety training for youth and adults? In states where hunting is recreational and kids learn about guns at a young age, but with BB guns, a different BB than your third topic, there's just a very different relationship with what a gun is for hunting first, and maybe for defense, not for offense or as a weapon. The gun violence in those places seems to be much lower, even though the gun ownership is quite high.
So first of all, Jessica, I want to know if the BB joke was yours or the questioner's.
It was the questioner's.
Okay, I was going to say nicely done, Jess, but nicely done, questioner. I have to admit, I don't know what the reaction is among conservatives toward gun training programs. And that's something I'm happy to check into and come back and talk with all of you about next week. But that's just not something I've seen discussed in the reading that I've been doing in preparing to talk about this topic on today's show. I'd offer this more broadly, though, as it relates to negotiations on any number of topics, but particularly that of gun violence. And I think I've referenced this with our group before, but right after the Sandy Hook shootings in some years ago, Bill Clinton, former President Clinton, was giving a speech to a Democratic National Committee meeting. And he was talking about gun violence and about gun control. And Clinton said to this group of Democratic activists and party leaders, he said, you know how strongly I feel about these topics. He said, you know, I fought for background checks and successfully fought for the assault weapons ban when I was president. He said, so no one believes in this agenda more than I do. And then Clinton said, but here's our problem. He said, I know a lot of good people down in Arkansas, friends of mine. And our problem is that many of them think that we think that they're stupid. And as long as they think that they're stupid and backward, they're not going to listen to what we have to say about common sense gun measures that are not going to interfere with their right to hunt or their right to protect their home and families. So we need to find another way, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, we need to find another way, Clinton argued, to have this conversation across partisan and cultural boundaries in order to move forward. And I think the example that the questioner raised is a perfect example of that. If you can create a common core in the Senate, like this gang of 20 that has begun working together on immigration policy, to talk about reasonable differences on gun policy in a measured and respectful way, then issues like training ought to be able to be discussed in a much more productive way than they are now, when both sides are just so convinced that their opposing numbers are stupid or evil or both.
Thank you so much. We're going to pivot to the topic of Israel now. Is Israel ready for an Arab party in the governing coalition?
Well, Israel has to be ready for an Arab party in the governing coalition. Because as I think many of you know, in last week elections, one of the Arab parties claimed a few seats. And given the way that the coalitions break down on both sides, both the, for lack of a better term, the pro-Bibi and the anti-Bibi factions, it looks like there are really two parties that have the potential to be kingmakers, or more accurately, prime minister makers. And there are a lot of people watching the Yamina party, the very conservative party run by Naftali Bennett. But the Arab party Ram has the ability right now to make someone the next prime minister of Israel. And so, barring a fifth round of elections, which is entirely possible, not only would a governing coalition need to consider including Arab members, but at this point, it's almost a prerequisite. Netanyahu himself campaigned much more aggressively for Arab votes in this last election than he ever has before. So have his opponents. The challenge that Netanyahu has in particular is if he were to bring the Arab list into his coalition, he would lose at least one, if not more, of the more ultra-conservative parties who's part of the coalition along with Likud. So it's more likely than not that if Nar did join a coalition, it would be the anti-Netanyahu group. But right now, like I said, Jessica, by definition, any party that wants to govern Israel with their prime minister and their coalition simply could not do so arithmetically without the support from Nar and from the Arab list.
We have a lot of people asking about Netanyahu's court case, so I don't know if you could comment or provide an update on that. Sorry, well, short question.
If Netanyahu, this is pretty simple. At least under the current laws of Israel, as long as Netanyahu is prime minister, the courts are restricted to the degree which they can pursue him for the allegations that have been made against him and against his family. The minute someone else becomes prime minister, those protections disappear. So don't get me wrong, to give him the benefit of the doubt, Netanyahu has no shortage of policy goals that he thinks he is best equipped to accomplish for the country, whether on the international or on the domestic front. But make no mistake about it, his legal status changes dramatically if he does not remain prime minister. And that raises the already very, very high stakes even higher. And I think when Netanyahu and Benny Gantz came to a power sharing arrangement after the third round of elections, Netanyahu's bottom line non-negotiable offer was, we'll both be prime minister, but I have to go first. Because he knew that if Gantz had become prime minister before him, then he would have become that much more legally, that much less legally protected. If there does end up being another power sharing arrangement, my guess is that Netanyahu makes the same demand, but given his somewhat weakened state, it's an open question as to whether the person or party with whom he's negotiating would accept it. But yeah, the questioner is exactly right. Prime Minister Netanyahu has a lot more protection than former Prime Minister Netanyahu. And Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that very, very well.
What happened to the Israel-United Arab Emirates agreement?
Well, the Israelis are continuing to move forward with agreements with any number of Gulf states. And in addition to those that have already been announced, there's already rumors that Israel will be expanding even further to a larger number of Arab states located on the Gulf. The biggest question, of course, is Saudi Arabia. What we know is that none of the countries who have entered into agreements with Israel would have done so if the Saudis were opposed to it. But the Saudi leadership themselves have so far not been willing to take that step, at least publicly. Privately, behind the scenes, they work with the Israelis on any number of matters the same way the other Gulf states do. But the public step and the political impact of Saudi Arabia and Israel formalizing their relationship the way Israel has with these other states, these other nations, would be much, much greater. And so, at least for right now, Israel's discussions with the Emirates, with Oman, with Kuwait, with others are proceeding apace. But each agreement that gets formalized increases momentum for other states to join in as well. But ultimately, the largest prize is Saudi Arabia. In the long run, that's what that's the relationship in the conversation to keep an eye on.
Israel just issued a travel advisory for its citizens not to travel to most Arab states due to threats from Iran. Do they know something that we don't?
Probably. Israel's intelligence agencies are extraordinarily well talented and devote an incredible amount of time and attention to trying to acquire intelligence as to Iran's leaders and its goals. One of the challenges that Israel's faced in recent years is it has fewer and fewer human resources on the ground in Iran. Because as the relationships between the countries have worsened, it becomes harder and harder for an Israeli espionage agent or spy to function inside of Iran. But even with those limited capabilities, Israel's intelligence, particularly in the Middle East and particularly with Iran, are very, very strong. The question is whether Israel offered that warning because they believed there was an increased threat, or because they wanted to send a political message as the United States and other countries were preparing to re-engage in negotiations with Iran. At the moment, it's sort of a moot point because Iran won't negotiate with the US, and I don't think that bothers Biden all that much for reasons we'll have to talk about in a future webinar. But right now, I would not be surprised if either instead of or in addition to a legitimate security threat that Israeli intelligence identified, that this was an announcement timed to send a message to the US, to the Western European countries and others about the dangers of moving forward too fast in negotiations with Iran. It could be both, but my guess is the message was the more important motivator as opposed to a tangible threat. Although obviously I'm not in a position to know that for sure. I'll defer to Mossad on that one.
Is anyone from the Likud party discussing a two-state Palestinian solution?
Not really. The biggest difference when it comes to international policy between Netanyahu and Lapid is that Lapid has called for a two-state solution, but I'm not aware of any significant voice within Likud that has said that's the right thing to do. And even though Lapid has staked out considerable political distance from Netanyahu by calling for a two-state solution, if you listen to him carefully, even though it is a more measured approach, it's not nearly as much of a move away from Netanyahu as it sounds like. Because though Lapid says, I want a two-state solution, the conditions that he has offered for that to exist reflect a distrust of the Palestinian leadership to the same level, or maybe almost to the same level as Netanyahu is. So I think that that's more of a rhetorical difference between the two than it is a substantive geopolitical difference of opinion.
Thank you. Final question. The Pentagon issued a report concluding that the climate crisis presented a national security threat to the US. What are the reasons that politicians do not want to acknowledge the Pentagon's conclusion?
I don't know that it's the politicians don't want to acknowledge the Pentagon's conclusion, but I think politicians fall into two categories on this issue. Those who are already enthusiastic supporters of more aggressive action to fight climate change, and those who are more hesitant. And if you want to push for climate change policy already, the Pentagon's warning is one more talking point, but it doesn't fundamentally change your message. And if you're more of a skeptic, then acknowledging this argument doesn't do your case any good. It's worth noting, and this is something we'll talk about, Jessica, you and Claire and Kim and I will have to figure out exactly when, but President Biden has called for a worldwide climate summit to be held virtually, of course, but with all of the world's leaders in late April. And so either the week before that or a couple weeks before it, we haven't talked about climate change as one of our issues for a long time. And so using that summit as the logical tie, it will give us a chance to get into this issue in much greater depth. The fact that the Pentagon made a declaration as stark as they did, the questioner is exactly right. It's an important statement. And right now it's one that simply reinforces opinions and beliefs, arguments on either side, but it becomes part of a critical conversation that we'll have going forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. We completed another hour. Next week, 49. I can't believe we're almost to 50. We'll have to do something fun to celebrate when we get to that number.
Here we go. Well, thank
Perfect.
you, Justin. Thank you all of you for being with us. As every week, the questions are phenomenal, and as every week, we're very flattered by how so many of you come to join us for these conversations. It's really a great compliment, and we're very glad so many of you enjoy them.